Okay, so skull. These are again copyright-free images that I found on the web. You can find a lot of these if you want to add, but these images will suffice. So basically, let me just first insert. I'm assuming you took a look at the Axial Skeleton PowerPoint slide, because I won't be going over that slide. That's basically a gist of the textbook. So skeletal system, basically that's what we are studying. Skeletal system, for you it's chapter 7 and chapter 8, I believe. We just looked at the histology of the bone tissue, but here is a bit of a jump. I understand that, but that's how the first few labs of 144 is going to be like. It's always been like that. We are not even talking about bone physiology yet, but we are looking at bone without looking at cell. Just because the lab is taking care of anatomy, the lecture is for physiology. So we are going to learn different type of bones within the body. Okay. So first thing first, skeletal system is a system that comprises of not just bone, but there is bone, there is tendon, there is ligament, there is cartilage as well, which are part of the tendon and ligament. There's blood forming tissue within the skeletal system too. We are studying bone, but that doesn't mean there is nothing beyond bone. Skeletal system, the main function of the skeletal system is to provide support to the organs, and it provides site for muscle attachment. So let me erase that. This thing is freezing. Come on, today is a bad day for things to freeze. Okay. No, I don't want to modify anything. I'm just trying to get to the eraser. Oh, this thing is freezing. So function of the skeletal system. I'm just going to go over a handful of them. First is support. Think about it. Rib cage supports the lungs. Sternum, basically what we call the breastbone. It supports the, protects, and the heart supports the internal organ. Our pelvic girdle, what we call the pelvis, supports the internal organ, holds the weight. So support, protect. Second is movement. Because of the skeletal system, we are capable of different type of movement like flexing, like pronating, supinating, actually locomotion, looking up, looking down, looking sideways, different types of adduction, abduction. So forms of movement are possible because we have bone. Third function is skeletal system is an attachment site for skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscles have just as much to do with the locomotion and movement as bones. So basically the way it works, that bones have different type of markings, as you will learn today. Sometimes we are calling them process, sometimes we're calling it tubercle, tuberosity, process, fossa. We are learning these names. Basically, any kind of ridge, rough surface, protrusion, etc. on bones are given names because those protrusion, those ridges, those rough surfaces, those round protrusion, those elongated protrusion, all of those serve as attachment sites for something. Okay. So because bones serve as, skeletal system itself serves as attachment site for skeletal muscle. When skeletal muscles contract and they're attached through tendon, we kind of went over just this part when we looked at the dense regular connective tissue. The way it works, that when the muscle contracts, the muscle pulls on the tendon pulls on the bone, and then the bone exhibits a movement. So movement is a function of skeletal system. The skeletal muscles also have just as much to do with the movement. That's why bones have so many different markings on them. Each marking serves as either an articulation site, meaning a site via which a bone moves with another bone, it articulates against another bone, or, here we go, or its attachment site for skeletal muscles. And the fourth function of the skeletal system is production of red blood cells. As we studied, bone tissue is rich, is vascular, and it has blood-forming tissue within. So formation of not just red, let's just say blood tissue, blood-forming blood cells. It's also the type of, this is the system that contains the blood-forming tissue. Then next, how do we divide up the skeletal system? We divide the skeletal system into axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. So this is just, why is this freezing up now? Today is a bad day. Everything is freezing. So how do we divide up the skeletal system? Basically the skeleton. Okay, so we divide the skeletal system into axial skeleton, and appendicular skeleton. That's how we'll be studying this. Axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. So axial skeleton typically has, we have overall 206 bone, 80 bones. You don't have to know that number. What are the different components of the axial skeleton? Basically the skull. Axial, if you break down this term, what does that tell you? Axis of the body, meaning the central, along the central torso of the body. So the skull, these are the components. Let me erase this for a second, appendicular skeleton. Then we have hyoid bone, which is considered a bone associated with the skull, but it's not part of the skull. So hyoid bone is kind of counted as by itself. Also, what we call auditory ossicles, bones of the internal ear. You can safely ignore this. We'll be talking about this later on in the semester. But hyoid bone, auditory ossicles. Then the vertebral column, it's a large part. And last is the thoracic cage. So skull, hyoid bone, auditory ossicles. These auditory ossicles are within skull, tiny bone. We are not going to be looking at this for this exam. Vertebral column, thoracic cage. When we say thoracic cage, what are we talking about? We are talking about a single bone, sternum, and the ribs, 24. Skull, which is made of what we call cranial bone and facial bone. Okay. So skull itself is cranial bone and facial bones. You'll find all of this in that PowerPoint slide. I'm just giving a short introduction. 8 cranial bone and facial bones. 14 facial bones. And that's what we're going to look at today. Okay. So first thing first, I'm just going to go over the bone marking a little bit so that you have an arbitrary idea of what are the different markings on the bone that we'll be looking at. And this is just a very generalized way of identifying them. And I'm not going by the textbook definition, but this is how I have learned them and I have found them to be helpful. So like I said, bones come with different types of marking. These markings, if they are long protrusion, meaning something that's long and it protrudes, visibly protrudes, typically protrusion, refer to that as process. So we'll be going over pterygoid process, styloid process, mastoid process. The moment you see the word process, we immediately know that a process is a long protrusion, a very visible, very specific, it's an obvious structure. It's something that protrudes and it's large enough to be well visible. We'll talk about tubercle. A tubercle is a small, oftentimes round and smooth protrusion. This is still a protrusion. It's like a knob. If there's a round, smooth, knob-like structure on the bone, you call that a tubercle. If that small, round protrusion is rough, you call it a tuberosity. May be round, may not be round, but it's small, not like a process. A fossa is a depression. A foramen is an opening. I'm just going to write here. I want to insert another slide. Foramina, you'll hear this term, foramen, foramina. Foramina is basically plural of foramen. Condyle or condylar. We'll be studying, maybe not today, we'll be studying, actually we will, condyle, occipital condyle. Condyle literally means, it's again, smooth components. I'm just going to write it here. Condyle is here. A condyle is a smooth component. Sometimes it's larger, round, sometimes it's flatter, but it's also obviously, it's a protrusion. But instead of calling it protrusion, call it a smooth component of the bone that has a specific purpose. That purpose is to articulate with other bone, meaning articulation is how a bone moves against another bone. Smooth component for articulation, meaning one bone sits on another bone and one of these bone A, let's say this is your bone B and here is your bone A. Bone A sits on bone B and bone A should be capable of rotating or side-to-side movement, any kind of movement. That literally means there has to be part of the bone A that sits into maybe grooves of the bone B. So these parts, the component of the bone A that would be slightly larger, kind of little bulge, we'll refer to those as condyle. Typically, a condyle can fit into grooves, and that group could be a fossa, depending on which bone it is, or that group could just be a surface. We'll see that for vertebral column, like facet. So if you have ideas of what these stand for, then you won't have to memorize. Just trying to memorize the names on the bone won't be helpful. There are just too many of them. Question?
Professor, I know you'll probably go into this, but can you give us an example of a condyle?
Occipital condyle, which is the back of your cranium. And then long bones have, when we go into long bones, we'll be talking about quite a bit of condyle. Lateral condyle, epicondyle. But right now for skull, we'll talk about occipital condyle. I'll be showing you that.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so keeping that in mind, the 8 cranial bones and the 14 facial bones. First of all, cranial bones and facial bones. How do we separate this? Pretty easy. If you think of the top portion of the cranium, basically the cranial bones, well, actually a little below. Cranial bones are, some of them are visible externally, some of them are not. Some of them are visible internally, which is why we're going to look at the skull. We're going to look at the superior view of the skull with the roof of the cranium intact. We are also going to look at the superior view of the skull with this roof being removed so that we can look at the internal cranial bones. So pretty much above the orbit, the bones are cranial bones. Some of the cranial bones are also visible through the orbit. Orbit is the name for eye socket. And what's below? These are different facial bones. So this is for reference. You can use this for reference. So this is a picture of one of the skull model that we have in our lab.
Professor?
Yes.
Sorry, before you go further, so cranial bone
Bones.
structures are the ones where above the eyes?
Yes, cranium stands for the area of the skull where the brain is located. So what create the space externally, and we'll be looking at it. If we cut this open, there will be bony structure inside too. So the 8 bones that form the roof, this top portion above the orbit, this is where your brain is, yes? Cranial cavity, you studied that. So basically the bones that form the cranial cavity together are the cranial bones.
Okay.
So 8 cranial bones. Frontal, 1 frontal, 2 parietal, which are visible, 2 temporal. So just overall looking at the location of this. Frontal is what makes your forehead. We'll be looking at those. Parietal is what makes the roof of your head, roof of the cranium. Temporal are where your ears are. Then occipital, which is on the posterior end, we'll be looking at that just in a second. And then there is sphenoid and ethmoid, which are only visible through the orbit or when you are looking at the interior of the cranium. frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, sphenoid, ethmoid. Transfer that here. What can we see? Frontal. For this view, we are looking at temporal. And again, I'm not going to go over every single one of them. It's not possible. Parietal, you don't really see that because I don't see the suture here. This is actually the beginning of parietal. You do see it. Parietal. This is one. This is one. Let me bring this one up here. Slide 8 before slide 7 for demo. So this is another image that I got from the web. This one shows you the delineation of the bone. So this is a left lateral side. So this lateral medial will come handy now. We're looking at the left lateral aspect of the skull. Frontal, parietal. This on left, there will be another parietal on the right. Occipital. This is the left, let me just say left temporal. Sphenoid, ethmoid won't be visible here. But we are looking at other bones. We are looking at facial bones, which we'll cover in a second. Let's just go over the cranial bones first. Then we can talk about the facial bones. So what are these lines then? Between frontal and parietal, what is that? Between temporal and parietal, what is that?
Sutures.
Basically, these are, oh, actually, sorry, you do see the part of the sphenoid. What am I talking about? Okay, so what is these lines? These lines are referred to as sutures. Sutures are lines where two bones join. Frontal joins with parietal. Parietal sphenoid join with temporal. Temporal parietal join with occipital, this line. And these sutures have names. The names are either given based on the plane along which the suture is present, like coronal, sagittal, or the shape of the suture. So right on the roof of the cranium, superior view and lateral view, we are going to look at 4 sutures. The suture between frontal and parietal, this is known as coronal suture. We'll look at the sagittal suture in a second. The suture between parietal, occipital, temporal too, but much of the suture is between parietal and occipital, this suture. This is referred to as lambdoid suture. I'm just writing S for suture. Then this suture between the parietal, sphenoid, occipital, but mostly between parietal and temporal, this suture here. This, refer to this as squamous. We have heard this term before. Flat, scaly, squamous suture. So 4 sutures: coronal suture, lambdoid suture, squamous suture, and there is a suture between 2 parietal bones. And that suture is visible only when you are looking at right on the top. So see that this is the frontal suture, not frontal, coronal suture. This is the sagittal suture. So coronal, sagittal, these are based on the plane, while the lambdoid and squamous are based on the shape. So let's look at come on now. Let me bring up your study list and see what are the different things that I can go over. Okay, so let's just identify some of the features here. What can we see? This is very, very new for you. So frontal bone, we don't have a whole lot of structure. Okay. Frontal bone, identify the bone, and then names. I'm looking at the 32, the list A, right on the frontal bone. Supraorbital notch, orbital surface. Instead of trying to memorize, just know what the name stands for. A notch is like a notch. Supraorbital, supra meaning superior. Orbital is for orbit. Notch, meaning a notch that's superior to the orbit as part of frontal bone. Do I see a notch? Yes, I do see a notch right there. It's not as visible on this side because these are plastic bones, but yes, it's visible right there. Supraorbital notch. So basically we'll call that supraorbital notch. Orbital surface. Let me explain that. Orbital surface or orbital surface. Basically, several bones together make up the orbit. What is the orbit made of? It's made of several bones together. So those bones that contribute to the structure of the orbit have a surface in them that's basically facing the orbit. Yes, it's the orbit. So I see there is something here, there, 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 oh, there, here. Basically, these are different parts of bones. These are individual bones that are making up the orbit. So that part of a bone which contributes to the orbit, which is part of the orbit, is referred to as orbital surface or orbital plate. So if you can identify frontal bone, you can see right there, this is the orbital surface. Initially, it's a little overwhelming, especially because we are looking at the images. But basically, that's what the orbital surface. Similarly, you can identify, oh yes, the bone, that cheekbone, zygomatic. This is the zygomatic bone. So that means this must be the zygomatic orbital surface. This is the maxillary bone. Okay, so maxillary bone. So here must be the maxillary orbital surface. Again, because we are testing on images, on the lab exam, I'll be giving you structures that are visible. Like you don't really see the lacrimal orbital surface. So I won't ask you to assume where it is, unless we do have an image that clearly shows it. The parietal bones, we don't have a whole lot. Let me go over the occipital bone. Occipital bone also, we don't have a whole lot, we just have two. So let's look at the posterior view here. Just like we looked at the lateral view here, occipital bone is best visible in the posterior view. You can see some of this here, but not too clearly. So we are looking at the posterior view. This is along its side. This is straight up. So you can identify the mandible. We're looking at the posterior view of the skull. So anterior view, we're looking at the posterior view. So basically, this is the back of your skull. See, this is the back of your skull. That's part of the temporal bone. Here you can actually kind of see the lambdoid suture a little bit. So this is the occipital bone. This is, anyway. So occipital condyle and foramen magnum are the only two structures that we have. Keep in mind, occipital condyle is for articulation. So they look like bulges, rather smooth bulges. Foramen magnum is the foramen through which your vertebral column and eventually within your spinal cord connects with the brain. Magnum meaning large. You can't miss that right there. Foramen magnum. If you identify the foramen magnum first, foramen magnum is basically, when we are looking left to right, let's say you are turning your neck from left to right, what is allowing your entire skull to turn from left to right? Basically the occipital condyles, which articulate with the first cervical vertebra. So where is the occipital condyle? If this is where let's look at this. If this is where the spinal cord, etc. comes in and my entire cranium rotates left to right, where would the occipital condyle be? On either side of the foramen magnum. Can I see bulges? Can you see bulges here? Yeah. On left and right of foramen magnum. So frontal, parietal, occipital.
Professor, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the condyles, because in the book, because I'm looking at the structure in the book right now with the
Mm-hmm.
colored, are they going to be more of depressions, or are they going to be, like you said, like
condyles are bulges. Depression will be on the other side. Whichever bone the condyles sit on. I'm just going to switch to video for a second. This is, no, I don't want to quit Zoom. Come on, show me the meeting control. Okay. Let me just show you this for, hey, why is it not giving me the, okay, right there. Okay, just for a second. So here, condyle, and what the, can you guys see my hands here? So condyle is basically, let's say I'm using my right hand here. See the part of my palm right there. This kind of protrusion, think of a condyle is like this kind of protrusion. Occipital condyle is like this. Every condyle is going to be a bulge, protrusion, not a long protrusion, a bulgy, bulky protrusion. What it sits on, what this condyle sits on, the palm of my other hand, basically, in the middle of the palm of my other hand. So condyle here, this sits on this here. So whichever bone receives the condyle, that's where you will find the depression. The condyle itself is going to be a bulge, a protrusion, because this is what allows you to rotate, right? I'm rotating my hand like this. Basically, that's how the skull will rotate because of the two occipital condyle. Each occipital condyle fits into a somewhat of a flat, not exactly depression. We'll look at the vertebra later, but basically somewhat of a flatter, smoother, slightly notchy surface. It's not exactly a depression. A full depression is a fossa. These are not fossa, but these are somewhat of a little notchy, flatter surface, like a cut surface, as if you take a, take a bead or take a stone and cut the surface and polish it. That's what it's like. And that's where the condyle will fit. If this is my cranium, this is the occipital condyle. This is that part of the first cervical vertebra where the occipital condyle fits into. This is what allows me the 180-degree rotation. So no, condyle is not a depression. I don't know where it's saying that. I don't think.
Didn't say it. It's just based on the inferior view. The way that the drawing looked like, it looked like a depression or some sort of a concave structure, but how that explains it perfectly. So thank you.
Yes. Condyle always, that's how you identify condyle. Condyle is going to look round, bulky, but smooth. Later on, we're going to talk about the mandible. Also, you will see that condylar process, round, bulgy, and smooth. Okay, so I would like to go over the more complex bones like sphenoid, ethmoid, temporal. Okay, so I'm going to go back and forth between these slides a little bit, not in order. So number 4, temporal bone. I haven't taught this lab for 10 years and I'm returning to teaching it online. Such a little choppy, I apologize. Especially the images and teaching bone via images. So temporal bone. Where is this temporal bone? Where was it articulated within the skull? Where in the skull did we see the temporal bone? Let's bring up that lateral aspect of the skull again. See this? Basically, this is all temporal bone. I'm going to use a different color. So this is what we are looking at. All of this is temporal bone. As if we remove the temporal bone and we are looking at it. For the exam, for features like this, I'll ask you in an articulated skull. Like this is an articulated skull. You still see the temporal bone to be right from here all the way. All of that is temporal bone. And that's what we're looking at in the picture of the temporal bone. The mouse is working. That's nice. Okay, so that was left side. We're looking at the right side. Temporal bone. Temporal bone has a petrous portion and a squamous portion. Let's identify those two first. Then we can identify structures associated with those. Petrous, squamous. Squamous we already know, flat, scaly. Now which part of this temporal bone looks flat and scaly to you? This. So that's the squamous portion. And write it as squamous portion of temporal bone. Petrous, meaning heavy, obtuse, bulky. Think of that. Lots of things together. Not flat, not fine, rather heavy, bulky. Think meaty. So, petrous portion. Some books will actually separate this, call this petrous and call this mastoid portion. I come from the school that just divide the temporal bone into two parts and include the mastoid into the petrous. So all of this is petrous portion. What are the different structures we can see in the petrous portion? The first thing that you see is a long protrusion. This long protrusion, see? And what do we call a long protrusion? What have we learned? A process. Exactly. So what do we call this process? We name this process based on which bone is going to meet up with. Well, how do you know which bone is going to meet up with? Well, let's check. Let's look at the lateral aspect of the skull again. Right there. We're looking at the temporal bone. This process is what we are looking at. Left lateral. So, which bone is it going to meet up with? Zygomatic bone. So the whole structure that basically, alongside our cheek, the kind of raised part of our cheek, this whole structure, this is called an arch. This arch is made by protrusion from the zygomatic bone, protrusion from the long protrusion from the temporal bone. Similarly, on the other side, it's the same thing. See, that's the zygomatic bone. So what do we name this process? Zygomatic process. Oftentimes the confusion is some students will see zygomatic process and say, oh, that's from the zygomatic bone. No, it's named not based on which bone it came from, but which bone it's going to meet up with. So this is temporal bone, that's zygomatic bone. This whole thing is called zygomatic. Why do I keep? I'm thinking matic and I'm writing that. This whole structure is called zygomatic arch. This zygomatic arch is made by the process from temporal bone, which we refer to as zygomatic process. And guess what we refer to the other side of the zygomatic arches, which is made from process from zygomatic bone. Same thing, based on the name of the bone it's going to meet up with, not the bone it came from.
Sorry, I thought you were asking us.
Yeah, yes, I'm asking you.
Oh, I was going to say a temporal process.
Temporal process, exactly. What I'm trying to do is trying to get you guys think about how this naming can work instead of just randomly. Too many students randomly try to memorize. Let me just look at the bone and I'll have a pictographic memory. Most of us don't. So, but if you remember the naming, you'll be able to retain this. It's an arch. So we call it zygomatic arch because it's next to the zygomatic bone. You can feel it with your finger next to your cheekbone. It's made by two long protrusion processes. One coming from the temporal bone, meeting up with zygomatic. So zygomatic process. One from the zygomatic bone, meeting up with temporal bone. So it's temporal process. So going back to the temporal bone again, that's what we are studying. Then I'll go over the sphenoid, ethmoid, and probably maxilla and mandible right there. So we are going to look at it. This is the external view. This is the view that will be able to see if you are looking at the skull. Then there is an internal view. Turn it around. If you are looking at from within the skull, what else can you see? Okay, so that part is taken care of. This is the zygomatic process. I'm just going to abbreviate a little bit. Okay, so then below that, where's the mandibular fossa? Okay. So below the, not below, but slightly inferior and slightly posterior. So this is the zygomatic process posterior to that and slightly inferior to that. See, that's the depression. This is a fossa. That depression, see that? That's a fossa. Fossa is to accommodate something. That something is the part of the mandible, the jawbone. So condylar process, we'll be looking at that. Condylar process of the mandible fits right into this fossa. So guess what we call it? Mandibular fossa. This is mandibular fossa. What's posterior to that? So this is how I always found that it's useful to have one isolated place, one reference point. And then I can name things based on that reference point. Okay, this posterior to that, inferior to that, posterior to that. This is how I learn. Or you can take this as your reference point and you can start calling anterior, 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 posterior, sorry, inferior. So zygomatic process, posterior to that is mandibular fossa. Posterior to the mandibular fossa, say this. This looks like a canal, or more like a thick groove. It's a groove. It's not just a fossa. It actually looks like something will go in there. So what do we call this? Change the color. What do we call this? This groove?
A foramen?
This is, no, foramen is like an opening, like your hand will go through. This kind of grooves, which is bony, and again, this part is frustrating for me because you can't see the interior of this. You are just going to look at the image, right? That's what we are doing. You're just looking at the image. This groove is actually where your ear canal, your auditory canal is. So a bony groove can be called what we call a meatus. So this is referred to as external auditory meatus. External auditory meatus. Meatus is a long groove or a shelf. External auditory meatus. So we got the zygomatic process, an arch, squamous, vitreous portion, external auditory meatus, mandibular fossa. Okay. Now let's look at the mastoid process and styloid process. Okay. So mastoid and styloid process. The mastoid process is posterior to that, posterior to the external auditory meatus. Mastoid, meaning again, mass, something that has mass, thick, mastoid. So look at this, thick, has mass. Process is a protrusion. This actually protrudes, is protruding. So this is mastoid process. Inferior to that is a thin and long process. Thin and long styloid. Basically, the name thin and long is styloid. So this here, if I change the color again, right there, see that? Styloid process, kind of fancy colors, but not very well visible. Styloid process. So you can either identify the mastoid process first and name based on the reference. What you are seeing here is actually the interior part. This is supposed to be internal. We'll be looking at that in a second. So externally, as you can see, squamous portion is flat. It's really there to form the suture. Petrous portion has all the structure. So you can either identify the mastoid process first. Best is mastoid and zygomatic. If you identify both, then you know which side is anterior, which side is posterior. Mastoid process is what you can feel behind your skull with your finger. If you identify these two, then you know anterior, posterior. For these bones, especially with images, long bones, medial, lateral, superior, inferior, other bones at least have some idea of which side is facing toward the front. This is where the side of the cheekbone is. This is the lateral part of the skull. Then you can start naming. Okay, first this, and then behind that, posterior to that, then posterior to that, inferior, posterior. You got reference then, as opposed to, and plus if you know, or depression, okay, depression. Which bone goes here? Mandible does. Mandibular fossa. Groove, okay, meatus. Yeah, these images again, they don't show all of the structures. I tried to take pictures of all of the temporal bone, but you know, you can only hold it at certain way and you can learn the structures. Let me see if you can see both the carotid canal and the internal auditory meatus. A little bit of assumption there. This is frustrating. I don't know. Maybe if I can show you both. Oh, I'll just show you the internal auditory canal, which is well visible here. So external auditory meatus, what we looked at here, basically this part of the temporal bone, this is where your auditory canal will be. So at the end of that, not really exactly end, but it looks like end. The end is actually around here. This is the internal auditory meatus. What will be hard to show you is the carotid canal. Good. Again, if you try to take a picture of the carotid canal, then basically the bone looks so obscured that you have no reference.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm trying to take notes. What's the, how can I describe the difference between the interior auditory meatus and the exterior?
External and internal.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
You do that by looking at the bone overall. See, this is clearly the external part because we looked at it from the integrated skull. So when you looked at the integrated skull here, you can see some of the structures there. So basically the squamous portion, the zygomatic process, that's all part of the external aspect. It's the external part of the bone, temporal bone. Internal part is what extends within the cranium. So external auditory meatus is what starts externally, your ear canal, think about that. And there is a long part of the bone, component of the bone that extends inside. And that ends with an opening that we refer to as internal auditory meatus, which is this opening. This is that long structure that we are looking at. This is this. Basically, that's what you're looking at. And yeah, I mean, I understand this all two-dimensional when it all should be three-dimensional, but what are we going to do?
So the internal auditory meatus would be if you took off the top of the skull and you looked inside. Is that correct?
Yes, top of the
Okay.
skull. Yes, exactly. If you took the top of the skull out and some of the scraped off the side of the temporal bone, basically that's what you're going to be looking at.
I have a quick question. Is the zygomatic arch going to be the combination of both the zygomatic process and the temporal process, or is
Yes.
the zygomatic, okay.
Yes, yes, the whole
Thank
structure
you.
is zygomatic arch. Okay, so let's look at the let's look at the sphenoid and ethmoid. And sphenoid, ethmoid, temporal, these are complex bones. Maxilla is not so much facial bone, but so this, I'm more likely to put this on test as disarticulated bone. Because it's kind of hard to know. I mean, we can look at this articulated skull. We'll be looking at that later on. And we can see some, actually you can see the carotid canal here. So we'll be looking at some of this here. But let's first look at the disarticulated bone, meaning the bone by itself, before you can see what it looks like in an articulated format. Okay, because this doesn't make sense unless you know which bone are we talking about and what do they look like individually. So this image is just the superficial view. You took the top of the skull off and you are looking at the floor of the skull. This is where the brain will be. Okay. So let's look at, next, let's look at sphenoid. So where is this sphenoid bone? Well, this sphenoid bone, basically external to this is going to be your eye socket. When we looked at the cranium, let's look at this here. So sphenoid bone, part of the sphenoid bone, see that opening there? So that's the bone around that is the sphenoid bone. This is what we are looking at. Much of the sphenoid bone is visible internally only. All you see externally, if you're looking into the orbit, is the orbital surface. Remember, we call it the orbital surface. So orbital surface. And this opening that looks like, almost like a shape of X. This is a close-up because you can't see the orbital surface without the close-up. But if we remove that close-up and you are looking at this here, you can kind of see that this is not just a foramina, not a round opening. It's more like this. Okay. So this is what we are studying, sphenoid bone. Just to give you a reference, it's a sphenoid ethmoid are deep within the cranium. Okay. So first, let's start with this. what can we see externally when you're looking at a skull? Which part of sphenoid bone can we see? Well, we can see this opening here, which the optic nerve will enter. This is basically, that's what this opening is for. So we refer to this as superior orbital fissure. A fissure is a fold, because it looks like a folded opening, kind of like a fishtail-like opening, you know what I'm saying? A fissure is like as if you have a structure here and you cut open and created a fishtail. That's what a fissure is, a split. So this is superior orbital fissure and the orbital surface of sphenoid. That's all we can see externally in an articulated sphenoid. Now, disarticulated sphenoid will show you other structures. So let's look at the sphenoid bone first, just the way it is. So this is what we call the inferior view of the sphenoid, meaning we are holding and we're looking at from the bottom of the sphenoid bone. I also have a posterior view here. Okay, so this part of the sphenoid bone is what within the cranium. This will be visible within the cranium. This part of the sphenoid bone, some of it is visible externally. A lot of it is not. It's still deep within cranium. Behind, think about behind your nasal cavity. So just to give a reference, what can we see from this view? What can we see from this view? First thing first, the reference of where this bone is, the orbital surface is right here. What we just looked at, orbital surface of sphenoid bone. This is that orbital surface. This is that orbital surface. That gives you some reference. From there, let's study the greater wings, lesser wings, the sphenoidal sinus, pterygoid process, sella turcica, and orbital surface. We don't have a whole lot of structure. Okay, so sphenoid is called the butterfly bone because it looks like a butterfly. Look at the internal aspect. So you see my fingers, what I'm holding against? I'm holding against these two processes. This is what I'm holding against. So these two processes protrude inferiorly. So this is almost like the body of the butterfly. This is also referred to as body of sphenoid. The body of the sphenoid bone, basically, is not a compact structure. It has space within, cavity within. Cavities within is a sinus. When we have cavities within a bone, it's typically referred to as a sinus. And that's what these holes are trying to tell you, that, oh, this is actually empty, it's hollow inside. So if we cut this open, you will see that there's a large opening, like a large cavity within. These cavities are what we refer to as sphenoidal sinus. Don't refer to the bone and call it sphenoidal sinus. The bone is just the body of the sphenoid. Long protrusion, this, what's protruding inferiorly. These two are what we refer to as pterygoid process. They are for attachment of different membrane. I'm just writing processes because there are two of them. Let me use a different color. So right there. pterygoid process. So orbital surface, sphenoidal sinus, pterygoid process. What will be these two that look like the wings of the butterfly? These wings of the butterfly are appropriately called the greater wings of sphenoid. Greater wings of sphenoid. And that will be all of this. Greater wings of the sphenoid. Well, if it's greater wings, does that mean there is a lesser wings of sphenoid? Of course, but it's not visible in this inferior view. For that, we have to look at the internal or the posterior view, right there. Where is the lesser wings? Where is the greater wings to begin with? All this. We just looked at the other side of it. Greater wings of sphenoid. So where is the lesser wings then? Of course, this. See how they look like wings, but they are smaller. These green ones are lesser wings because one on left, one on right. Lesser wings of sphenoid. Okay, I thought I had foramen ovale at least on your list, but I think I must have removed it. Okay, if it's not there, I won't be adding it with images here. Just FYI, this kind of larger foramen, these are called foramen ovale. Therefore, this foramen, this is what a foramen is. Foramen is an opening. Typically, foramen is for passage of nerves, blood vessels, etc. It's not on your list, but I'm adding it here just in case you are wondering and you want to learn a little more. So lesser wings of sphenoid, greater wings of sphenoid. We looked at the pterygoid process, the sphenoidal sinus. What else is visible here? Well, something else. I see that there is this saddle-like structure. See this. All of that looks like a saddle that we put on horse to sit. And so this looks like this is a place to accommodate something. Something sits in here. This is referred to as sella turcica. Sella turcica. The entire structure is sella turcica. Well, actually, maybe I should not have put this asterisk right in the middle. There are different parts of the sella turcica. Basically, this has a name, this has a name, and this has a name. The middle depression, like sitting area, has a name. I usually just, because we have plenty of names to deal with, I usually don't require the students to know the individual names of this and this, but I do require to know the name of the actual depression of the saddle. This depression here, right in the middle of the sella turcica, here, this is referred to as, just a second, this is referred to as hypophyseal fossa. Fossa is a depression, that's understandable. Why is it called hypophyseal? Hypophysis or hypophysis is a name for pituitary gland, a major endocrine gland. We'll be talking about this for next lecture exam. This is where the pituitary gland sits. The interstellar torsica basically is there to hold the pituitary gland and protect it. What was the question?
Oh, yeah, I was asking if that's where the pituitary gland sits.
Within the hypophyseal fossa. So basically the rest of the stellar torsica, which are like, just elevated ridges, are there to hold the pituitary in place and protect it. Okay, I think that covers sphenoid bone. Questions? And again, I feel really strange teaching this, holding the bone images, but what are we going to do?
Professor, I was thinking about it because it's kind of hard for me on my end to like anticipate what structure you're looking at. And I'm wondering if you would be able to bring these home and be on the video, pointing with your finger, or have some type of like ability to highlight where your cursor is so that it's easy to visually see.
You mean my cursor like this?
Yes.
How does that helps better than actually outlining the whole structure? I tried video like holding, I have the bones at home, but then I don't think that would be helpful because you don't have the bone at home. I can hold it and I can show you the structure just for reference. But since you are only looking at the image, it's hard if I just do the video of the bone and show you. So that takes, that takes basically 5 minutes to take a quick MP4 video and upload that. But last semester when I did that, most students said we couldn't really understand the structures because you are looking at 2-dimensional while I'm looking at 3-dimensional. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess it's just hard to
It is a hard situation. We are in a difficult place. That said, I am open to whatever helps. But you'll see that starting a video and showing you the sphenoid bone, and showing you the sphenoid bone on the video right here, unless I have like a dark background. Go figure, where's the dark background? See, that really doesn't do much. You know what I'm saying? Okay. I can take an iPad or an iPhone and take a video. This is what I did last semester. And that really didn't help the students because I'm looking at the 3-dimensional and say, okay, see, this is the pterygoid process. This is the inferior view. These are the greater wings. Well, look at this. These are the lesser wings. But you don't have that 3-dimensional structure in front of you. You are only looking at a 2-dimensional structure.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if I can, I don't promise it, but if I can find time, I don't mind doing the like 5-minute demo of sphenoid just on my iPhone and uploading that. But in past, that didn't help.
No, I see where you're coming from. Just for when you're speaking about a structure and then you highlight it, I just wanted to like, because like there's like a delay in knowing what structure you're looking at. That's the only issue that I have is like, okay, where are we looking at right here? You know what I mean? Like, so that's the only thing I had to say. But I'm fine with the pictures. The video is kind of small.
Yeah, there is no other way.
Yeah, no worries. We can move on.
Unless you had. Go ahead.
I think Professor Shearer has a video she did last semester at least of the ethmoid and the sphenoid where she like points with a straw. I'll double check on her channel, but she did have it up last semester. So maybe if you're wanting both, then you can look on her channel as
I'm
well.
sure she's doing, because she's doing a demo for the other section. She's not teaching the synchronous lab. She's doing demo and uploading them. So I'm pretty sure she has demo of the sphenoid and ethmoid. So video demo, you mean? Pointing with a straw with the on the bone?
Yeah, so she just I don't know, I think it was when we were still actually in lab when we were first transferring over,
Yes.
and so she was
Yes.
able to still go to school. So I'm pretty sure, I'm not sure if it's up this semester, but it's on her YouTube channel playlist that you linked to our
For the skull?
Canvas.
Yes. Yeah.
So it should be on there. So I just double check if everyone's or if people are wanting that same
Yeah.
view.
Okay. Yeah, those demos are very doable. You know, just taking out, all I have to do is take the iPhone or iPad and basically hold it and then point at structures. But then when it comes to the lab exam, I'm not testing you on a video, I'm testing you on two-dimensional images. So you have to transfer that into the image then, you know what I'm saying? Because this is what I'm testing you on while I'm showing you something else. I'm showing you the video. That was at least my understanding, but yeah, if the videos help, I'm pretty sure she is uploading demo because she's teaching asynchronously. I can do one or the other. Like I said, I can't do both. It'd be hard to do both. Okay. So maybe one of you would be responsible to just communicate to me if the demo, I mean, the demos are there. You can take advantage of what she's doing, and let me know if if that's helpful. Can one of you do that?
I would volunteer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Because this is not my ideal. This is what I started out last semester also. That's what I started doing. I started doing short demos for my 145 students, and all of them unequivocally said that, Professor, you are showing the model from different angle, but we are just looking at the image. So this can be reference, but trying to transfer that to the image that we are going to be tested on is difficult. So can we just take images and can you go over the images? So I said, okay, if that helps, that's what I'm going to do. But yeah, personally, both of them are, you are between the rock and the hard place. Picture or watch the video and figure out the structures. But all of us, we are just doing the best we can under the circumstances. So yes, whoever volunteer, let me know. Because I'm trying to figure out that, what should I do? Should I just continue on with this or should I just do short demos myself? And part of the reason is because I did not teach this lab for 10 years. So I'm returning after 10 years into this online environment. So, I'm kind of figuring out myself what would work best. So I'm going by what worked best for my 145 students last semester and repeating that here in the 144, which is take the pictures, take the images, and point out at stationary structures. You don't have a model, you don't have anything 3D. Okay, so that said, I'll see if I can do quick short demos of few bones and upload them on YouTube. Okay. But I can't promise that on every bone, because that just takes too long. Okay, so any question about the sphenoid? So we talked about the temporal, the sphenoid. I would like to cover the ethmoid and the mandible and maxilla. Okay, is there anything critical for me to read on the chat? Are there questions on the chat?
No,
Okay, it's not
just the
bringing.
link.
Okay, okay, so somebody's posting the link. Great, thank you. Yeah, help each other out. We just go as we go along. We help each other out. So ethmoid bone, disarticulated ethmoid bone, right here. So where is that ethmoid bone? Let's look at the reference and we'll go over that after I'm done with the sphenoid and ethmoid. We'll look at the floor of the skull. And from that perspective, look at the ethmoid bone. So here in this is the floor of the skull. The cranium is gone, the roof of the cranium is gone, the floor of the skull. So again, we are looking at this is where we are looking at the sphenoid bone. Look at this. This is the sphenoid bone. This is the temporal bone. That's the sphenoid bone. This is the occipital bone. This is the frontal bone. This is the ethmoid. See that the celotorsica, the lesser wings of sphenoid, the greater wings of sphenoid. Can you guys see that within the cranium? The pterygoid process. So this is what we are looking at, ethmoid. We'll look at this later.
Introduce you in person.
You might want to mute yourself. Okay, so ethmoid bone. Again, the reference point in ethmoid bone is pretty easy. There is one single structure of the ethmoid bone, which basically stands out like a coxcomb, so to speak. So this is the ethmoid bone's superior view. This is what we are looking at earlier. Earlier here. Where is the floor of the cranium? Oh, here. Basically, this is what we are looking at. We are looking at the same reference. So this is from the superior view. Ethmoid, we are going to look at that from the superior view, the inferior view, and the posterior view. From the superior view, this is floor of the cranium, to give you that reference, floor of cranium. This is what will be visible on the floor of cranium. This structure that's protruding up, it's actually up, out like that, like a coxcomb. This is what we refer to as, see all of that, this is what we refer to as crista galli. Crista galli. The rest of the This flat plate, see that? It's a flat plate. This flat plate, this is the roof of your nose. This is what makes up the roof of your nose. This is referred to as cribriform plate. Cristagalli, cribriform plate. These tiny openings, see that? There, 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 all throughout. These tiny openings on the cribriform plate are referred to as olfactory foramina. These openings, these are olfactory foramina. Foramen is individual, foramina plural. Basically, this is the roof of your nose. When we inhale something, through this roof of your nose, through this olfactory foramina, which allows different branches of the, tiny branches of the olfactory nerve to basically receive signals. This is how we smell things. That's why we have olfactory foramina. Olfactory, olfaction, meaning smelling. So you want to identify something, Cristagalli. Cristagalli will tell you that, oh, this is the superior view, because Cristagalli stands out like that. Ethmoid bone has a lot of structures, but they are relatively easier to identify if you have that reference. In reference to the Cristagalli, Cristagalli arises from the cribriform plate. So that is all cribriform plate with olfactory foramina. What else can we see here? We see this opening to the cavity. We see the body of the ethmoid is not solid either. These cavities show that it's hollow inside. And when you have cavity within the bone, we refer to it as what again?
Foramen?
Foramen? No, not foramen.
Sinus
Foramen,
cavity?
sinus. Sinus. So just like for sphenoid bone, we call it sphenoidal sinus. What would we refer to this as? What would we call this?
Ethmoidal sinus?
Yes. Ethmoidal sinus. Cavity within the ethmoid bone. Ethmoidal sinus. Cavity within the sphenoid bone. Sphenoidal sinus. Cavity within the maxillary bone. Maxillary sinus. So certain bones within the cranium are not solid. They have cavities within. And those sinuses, cavities are sinuses. Sinuses are named according to which bone houses those sinuses. So Cristagalli, right there. Cribriform plate with olfactory foramina. And then ethmoidal sinus. This is what we can see in the superior view. This is the superior view. Okay, so now let's flip this. You know what, let me try this. Let me try lowering the screen and see if I can turn the video on and do something here. Okay, so because this is getting recorded, I'll just throw this in. So this is the ethmoid bone. Okay, it's the entire ethmoid bone. And we are looking at this superior view of the bone. This is the superior view of the ethmoidal bone. So Christogoli, this is what we just looked at. See that? Coxcomb, Christogoli, cribriform plate with olfactory foramina and ethmoidal sinus. This isn't really working well. I don't know how to hold it properly. So moving on, going back to the image. Inferior view. So this is the inferior view of the ethmoid bone. On the inferior view, and there's a posterior view. These go kind of hand in hand. Posterior view, inferior view. So on the inferior view, what do we see? Again, have that reference point. Right in the middle. So basically what you're seeing here, that's the cribriform plate. Cribriform plate. So this structure, let me change the color. This structure here, this, all of this, which is coming down perpendicularly, as in case you can see here. Cribriform plate. This is the posterior view. We are looking at the back of the ethmoid bone. Christogoli will be on the other side. See how this is coming down. This is coming down at 90-degree angle. Because it's coming down at 90-degree angle, this is referred to as perpendicular plate. So the same thing that we're looking at here. Perpendicular plate. Have that as your reference because perpendicular plate is right in the middle, coming down at 90-degree angle. So if this is the cribriform plate, then the perpendicular plate is coming down at a 90-degree angle. And then there are other structures which are immediately next to the perpendicular plate or slightly higher up. And they are named according to their position in relation to the perpendicular plate. Like middle nasal concave and superior nasal concave. Nasal concave, concha, individual concave. Concave are again bony shelves. These are all within your nasal cavity. Deep within your nasal cavity, these bones will be present. So middle nasal concave, toward the middle. Which one is toward the middle? Whatever is next to the perpendicular plate, because perpendicular plate is exactly dividing the ethmoid bone into two halves. So I'm going to use different color. So this is a pair of bony shelves. And then this also is a pair of bony shelves. See that? This also is a pair of bony shelf. This is the shelf. Basically that gives rise to the shelf. So which one would be middle and which one would be not middle? Next to the perpendicular plate, these two are middle because they are toward the middle. Middle nasal concave. If you are referring to one, you call it concha. without the A. Together, concave. So in relation to this middle nasal concave, that's why you first identify the perpendicular plate in the middle, exactly in the middle. Next to that, middle nasal concave. Superior to that, these two, superior nasal concave. All of these are inferior view. So what can we see in the inferior view? We can see the other side of the cribriform plate. You see the perpendicular plate, the middle nasal concave, the superior nasal concave. Once you get familiar with these bones, which are pretty complex, then, you know, pectoral girdle, pelvic girdle, vertebra, these are much easier to comprehend, which is why, you know, we are spending this much time on the cranium, because they are pretty weird shaped, complex looking bones. Posterior view, again, you can see the perpendicular plate. You can see the middle nasal concave. And the other side, we don't see it, but here you can see, at least on the left, superior nasal concha, not K. So you see the cribriform plate, perpendicular plate, middle nasal concave, and superior nasal concha. The other side is a bit hidden. It's right there. It's a bit hidden. And on the superior view, you can see the cribriform plate, crista galli, ethmoidal sinus. You can even see the beginning of the perpendicular plate. So if you look at the image from all different sides, you can identify the structures. Again, that disarticulated skeleton that you have and the Microsoft free book, you can turn the bones around. But I have no way of testing you with a 3D turning image in the canvas. It's a flat 2-dimensional.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Will you be, should we expect to see all 3 views on the test or just one position?
No, all 3, because you can't see different structures from single view. You can only see handful of structures on one, handful on the other. So yes, all 3 views. If you learn it like that, also then your learning is a little more solid. I mean, as well as you can from images.
I have a question regarding the ethmoidal sinus. When you're looking at it from the superior view, and again, I'm referencing both your photos and the book, olfactory foramina just closer to the crista galli and then a little bit smaller, and then the ethmoidal sinus, those cavities are going to be a little bit bigger, correct?
Yes, olfactory foramina are on the cribriform plate.
Okay.
The cribriform plate does not exist without. Think of it like a porous plate. Cribriform plate, if we just separate this part, let's say we cut this, section it, and we are looking at, then olfactory foramina are all over. Cribriform plate does not exist without olfactory foramina. The plate itself has these pores, and the pores together collectively what we are referring to as foramina. Yes, they are small. They are right on the cribriform plate. Ethmoidal sinus is below the cribriform plate. Cribriform plate is the roof of this sinus. So if you remove this whole thing, we'll be able to see that, oh, the ethmoidal bone, the structure of the ethmoidal bone is not solid. This is all cavity. We're only taking a glimpse, looking at a glimpse of that cavity. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and then the ethmoidal sinus will have, it won't necessarily be like two cells, it will be multiple cells underneath the cruciform.
Yes, that's why they are also referred to as ethmoidal cells.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, so any other question? Then let's move on to the facial bones. The facial bones, go away, hon. Let me just insert a slide here. Some of these facial bones are pretty easy. You know, if you can look at them, and most of them are on the articulated skeleton is what we are, or at least I am asking for. Okay. So what are the facial bones? Let's first know the name of the bones, and it's all in the PowerPoint as well. So we got two maxillary bone, individually called maxilla, maxillary bones. Then we got two palatine bones, two nasal bones, one vomer, two inferior nasal concave, two zygomatic bones, two lacrimal bones, and one mandible. Total 14 facial bones. Out of these, maxilla, mandible are a little more complex. So we are looking at the maxilla and maxillary bones and the mandible as disarticulated bones, meaning by itself. The rest of the bones, we are just identifying them integrated into the skull. So they are not that complex. Okay, so starting with maxilla here. So let's look at the reference first. Where is it in the skull? Where is it on the skull? Where is the maxillary bone on the skull? Basically, trace this line. All the way to where the teeth are. So I'm going to back off a little bit and show you here. Where are the two maxillary bones? There it is. One on the left. There it is. One on the right. Not this though. That's nasal bones. So these two are the two two, just a second, let me erase that. maxillary bones. While we are at it, let's just identify whatever we can. Mandible. And the color-coded picture in the textbook, that's pretty good. I'm going to erase some of the cranial bone here because our focus is now facial bone. Okay, so right in the middle, right there, these two are the nasal bones. Make up the elevated part of the nose, what we call nose. The bottom portion, the inferior portion of that is made of cartilage. The top is two nasal bones. So the superior part of the nose is made by nasal bones. How about the nasal septum? What's separating the nasal cavity into two sides? The bottom, this, right there. This is the vomer. Where is the inferior nasal concave? Let's deal with that. Inferior nasal concave. So what you are looking within the nasal cavity, see the roof of the nose, interior, inside, that's where the ethmoid bone is. What you're looking at on the top right there, this is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. Right there, this is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. At the inferior part of that. So think of your nasal septum. If you stick a finger in your nose, you'll feel the cartilage in the middle. That cartilage is attached on top, on superior aspect to this perpendicular plate. On the inferior aspect, at the floor of the nose, that cartilage is attached to the vomer. So what nasal septum is, if I'm to draw like a cartilaginous plate here, this is what the cartilaginous plate will look like. Attaching to the perpendicular plate on top, attaching to the vomer on the bottom. Inferior nasal concave are these two inferior bony shelves here. This and this. These two are the middle nasal concave and the superior nasal concave. You can't see it. If you had the skull in front of you, you can see it as tiny ridges. This is plastic skull, so it's not ideal. So these two, I'm going to erase it from one side and mark it on the other. So this and this, these two. Lovely. I had it on eraser. I didn't even realize. So maxilla. This and this. Inferior nasal concave. If it's just on one side, we call it concha. So we got the two nasal bones, two maxillary bones, one mandible, two inferior nasal concave, vomer. In order to see the palatine bone, that's the only bone that's only visible when you take off the mandible and you are looking at the inferior aspect of the entire skull, meaning bottom of this, bottom of the maxilla, behind this teeth. So we'll do that at the end. What else can we see here? Zygomatic bone. Where are the zygomatic bone? Follow the zygomatic arch. This and this. Right there and there. These two are the zygomatic bones. So we pretty much got, other than the lacrimal, I'm going to show that next. We got almost all the facial bones, lacrimal and palatine. That's what's left. Lacrimal is the harder one because unless you really have to hold the skull close in order to see the lacrimal bone. But here we identify that. You can identify if you look for, especially on the left side here, because your left is skulls, right? We are looking at it anteriorly. So if you look at this here, see that this one here is kind of like a ridge there. This ridge is lacrimal bone. See that? This is lacrimal bone. We've got two of these, one on each side. You can see it on the left. You don't see it on the right. This kind of shows it, lacrimal bone. See? So look for this ridge, what looks like a demarcation, delineation. If I erase this here, see that? Basically, that's the lacrimal bone, immediately next to the nasal bones. Nasal and maxillary bone, lacrimal bone. This is where your eye will be. Through this lacrimal bone, there's a lacrimal fossa, which unfortunately we can't see. Through this lacrimal fossa, basically tear will be transported into your nasal cavity. So when we cry, the tears end up in your nasal cavity. That's what this is. From here, lacrimal bone.
Professor, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, going back to the nasal area,
Mm-hmm.
superior to the inferior nasal concha, there's like another, looks like
These
another
two?
concha.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What would that be called? Do we have to know that structure?
Oh, this is middle nasal concave.
Oh, okay.
I was saying that because these are plastic skulls. They are not ideal. So the inferior nasal concave, they are showing it a little too higher up, but that's what we have here. This too. So this whole thing, all of that is part of the ethmoid bone. Inferior nasal concave are separate bones by themselves, but the middle and superior nasal concave are part of ethmoid bone, as we just studied. So I'm going to erase this cartilage that I drew for convenience. And let's look at this. So that's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. These two are the middle nasal concave. Use a different color. I'm kind of running out of colors now. Light green. These two are the middle nasal concave.
Thank you.
Sure. The only thing you don't see here is superior nasal concave.
So the inferior nasal conchae are not part of the maxilla or the
No, they're by themselves. Those are counted as, that's why I wrote two inferior nasal conchae, they're counted as separate bones.
Perfect, thank you.
Sure. So now let's look at what can we see here for maxilla. Maxilla and mandible, I'll cover those two. So first thing first, for maxillary bones, let me see what I have on the, and then, I'll take care of the palatine bone and palatine process last. We got infraorbital foramen, maxillary sinus, palatine process, alveolar process, orbital surface of maxilla. Okay. So orbital surface of maxilla. If this is the maxillary bone, here will be the orbital surface of the maxilla. Infraorbital foramen. Well, that's easy. Within the body of the maxilla, the maxillary bone, I'm going to erase some of this here so that I can write new things. Let's just take care of the maxilla. So orbital surface of maxilla or maxillary bone. Infraorbital foramen. Inferior to orbital orbit, foramen, and opening. Do we see openings here? Yeah, right there, right there. Inferior to orbit, orbital, foramen, opening. So these two, let me change the color. These two are infraorbital. Well, technically we'll call it foramina if we are referring to both. Foramen if we are looking at a single maxillary bone. I'm just going to write foramina because it's more than one. Because we are looking at two maxillary bones, one on left, one on right. The teeth sockets, those are, the anatomical name for them is alveolar or alveoli, not alveolar, alveoli. Alveoli is in lungs, most of us know that, but each socket for a tooth is referred to as an alveolus as well. So when it comes to the bones, an alveolus in a bone is basically a groove that holds a tooth. So that part of the maxillary bone, this is like in the middle, right and left maxilla. So alveolar process, a process is a protrusion. So this entire protrusion that holds the alveoli, meaning teeth socket, we refer to that as alveolar process of maxilla. You have to give the reference of maxilla because there is a second alveolar process, that of the mandible, which holds the lower teeth. So for each maxillary bone, this part, which holds the teeth socket, this is what we, let me use a different color. This is what we refer to as, ooh, I love orange. This is what we refer to as, from here to here, this is what we refer to as alveolar process of maxilla or maxillary bone. So integrated into the skull, this is what we can see from an anterior view. We can see for the Most of the facial bones are visible: mandible, maxilla, nasal bone, lacrimal bone, inferior nasal concave, zygomatic bone. All of these are visible. Vomer, palatine process and palatine bone, palatine process of maxilla and palatine bone. Basically, these are part of what makes our palate. Palate is the roof of your mouth, to give you the reference. When we say palate, what are we referring to? The roof of your mouth. Twist your tongue and touch the roof of your mouth. The first part, anterior part, immediately behind the tooth, posterior to the tooth. When you're touching it with your tongue, the anterior part is part of maxilla. The posterior part toward the throat is palatine bone. With that in mind, let's look at the inferior aspect of the skull so that we can see the palatine bone and the palatine process of the maxillary bone. So here we are looking at the inferior aspect of the skull. We looked at this before. Okay. So inferior aspect of the mandible. And we are looking at the inferior aspect of the maxilla. This is the roof of your mouth. Your tongue will be here. Where is the palatine bone and where are the palatine process of the maxilla? This is why I said anterior and posterior. This is toward anterior, toward the mandible. This is toward posterior, toward the sphenoid bone. We're actually looking at the part of the sphenoid bone right there. Part of the pterygoid process toward sphenoid bone. So anterior toward mandible or toward the teeth, make it simple. Posterior toward the deeper part of the cranium. Foramen magnum, sphenoid bone, that's what we're looking at. Where is the maxilla? Where is the palatine process of the maxilla or maxillary bone? And where is the actual palatine bone? The palatine bone basically is immediately, it articulates with the sphenoid. Deeper part of your palate is the roof of your mouth. So basically, this here, not extend it to that, right there. These are the two palatine bones. And they are only visible from the inferior aspect. Palatine bones are probably the deepest bone of the cranium. Left and right. Foramen magnum, that gives you what it is, left and right. These are the two palatine bones. What is palatine process then? Just like temporal process, zygomatic process, named after which bone they're meeting with. The part of the maxillary bone that meets up with palatine bone is referred to as palatine process. So where would that be? The rest of the palate. This is one, this is the other, because we are looking at two maxillary bones. One is left, one on right. So this is what are referred to as palatine process of maxillary bone. Or processes, if you are referring to both. Got that? So we covered the structures of the maxilla except for the maxillary sinus. We'll look at the disarticulated maxilla next. So articulated and disarticulated, learn them both. Whatever images are here on this file, learn these images. So I just took a number of images and downloaded some. Wherever you can see the best representation that's possible in a two-dimensional view of the bones we are studying. So we are, actually let me go back to the skull here. So we looked at this. Now let's say we are removing this maxilla. We're extracting it out. From here to here, all that is maxilla. We're extracting this. And we are looking at that maxilla here. This long, extended, this is actually not, I mean, there is a name, but don't worry about the name. So basically, this extended thing, this is what's going to meet up with the nasal bone. And this tells you whether it's the left or right maxilla. Is this going to be on the right side of your face, or is this going to be the left side of your face?
Right side.
Which one? Your face, meaning the perspective of your face, not what you are looking at. If your nose is going to be here, is this the left side of your face or right side of your face?
The right side.
The right side, exactly. See, mirror imaging. What you are saying is on the left side because you are looking at it like you are looking at a mirror image and you say, oh, that's left. But from anatomical perspective, is it the right side of your face or left side of your face? This is the right maxilla. Because you look at this is what this long thing, that's why the reference points, I like them so much. If you learn it like that, the orientation becomes so much easier as opposed to just trying to have the names. How do I know it's right side? Well, look at this. This is what meets up with the nasal bone. That means my nose is going to be here. If my nose is here, then my cheek is here, meaning my zygomatic bone is here. This is toward my temple. That's the right side. This is where the bottom of the nasal cavity, this is where the concave will be. Infraorbital foramen, orbital surface, of maxilla or maxillary bone. Alveolar process. Of maxilla or maxillary bone. You can either call it maxillary bone or maxilla. Now let's turn this bone. So we are basically looking at the interior of the same bone that we are looking at the exterior aspect. So this is internal. You can see the teeth. So let's name that. We already know that's called alveolar process of maxilla. I'm not writing of maxilla, but alveolar process. That makes this palatine process. The palatine bones will be deeper. This is the roof of your mouth. This is what I was saying, that toward the anterior is the palatine process of the maxilla. Toward the posterior, if the bone was drawn here, the actual palatine bone will be here.
I have a question real quick.
Yes.
So I'm pretty sure the answer is going to be yes, but I just want to make sure. So we're on the test, we're going to have to specify left and right, correct?
wherever you can. Wherever is well visible, you can. Like for temporal, it's pretty clear. If you look at the temporal bone, mastoid process, the back of your skull, you immediately know that this is the right temporal bone. So yeah, wherever you can, yes. It applies more to the long bone, the right and left, but some of the cranial bones, it's a good thing to know because it gives you a very clear perspective. If you know that this is the right mandible, you immediately know that this is where the zygomatic bone will be. This is where the nasal concave will be. You know what I'm saying? Even if I don't ask you it on the exam for the maxillary bone, if you know it yourself, you immediately know that this is the superior end, that's the orbital surface. This is the part that's going to meet up with the zygomatic bone. This is where the nasal cavity will be. So knowing the left and right pretty much gives you a much cleaner, clearer perspective. So it's always helpful whenever you can to learn the left and the right. On the exam, I'm more likely to ask you left and right for long bones. But knowing this, I might ask for one. It's helpful for you. So palatine process, alveolar process, this opening here, large opening, maxillary sinus. So this extends within the body of the maxilla, maxillary sinus. Did we get this? This is just to show you the occipital condyle. See that? Occipital bone with the occipital condyle and foramen magnum. Or condyles. This is how a surface of condyle would be, smooth, because it rotates, it turns. Then look at mandible. There are some nice images that don't have copyright issues, which I could download. So mandible. Again, this is a good place to look at what a condyle would look like. So mandible, this is the anterior part of the mandible. That's the posterior part. So the posterior, the anterior portion beside the alveolar process, which is right here. Alveoli, tooth socket. This part that holds the tooth socket, alveolar process of mandible. Specify of what? Because maxilla also has alveolar process. Alveolar process of mandible. Just one, because there is only one mandible. This one shows you a little better. See that depression here? All of that is alveolar process of mandible. Actually, let's ignore this. This is for your reference. And let me just go over the structures here. What's left if you remove the alveolar process from this is the anterior aspect? That's the posterior aspect. Rest of it, what I'm drawing orange dots over, all of this. This is what we refer to as the body of mandible. The anterior part of the mandible, if you remove the alveolar process, what remains anteriorly is the body of the mandible. Within the body of the mandible, there is a foramen. That foramen is the, this is the, that didn't really work very well. Let me see, what are the dark color? Oh, dark blue is good. This foramen is the, what is it?
Mental.
Mental foramen. So when you go to get dental work done, and if the dental work actually requires some digging, etc., surgery, and they inject an anesthetic, they're injecting it into the mental foramen. This is what they look for right on your, at the bottom of your gum, and they inject. Anesthetic is typically injected into this mental foramen, because this is where, you don't have to know it for the exam, but this is where the trigeminal nerve passes through. So mental foramen have nothing to do with mental, unless you are looking for mental peace during your dental work. I so really don't know how that name came around, mental foramen. Okay, what about this flat angle? This angle is what we refer to as ramus. You don't have to say ramus of mandible unless you're learning everything of mandible. I like to always refer to the bone. That's how I remember a full picture. You can call it just ramus, but trust me, it's a better way to learn as ramus of mandible. For our brain, it gives us a complete picture, not only a word, but a word has association. Ramus of mandible. And then superior part, superiorly, we're looking at the posterior part of the mandible, superiorly, these are the two processes. Processes, long protrusion, one of them flat, one of them round. So guess what we call them? Flat one is typically called coronoid process. Coronoid is a corona. Corona is almost, what should I say? Corona is anatomically.
A crown?
I can't hear you. What's that?
Crown?
Round. No, anatomically coronoid. It's typically, that name is given to processes that are not round.
Oh, no, I mean a crown.
Oh, crown. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, crown. Coronoid process. And this is a bulky round bulge meant for articulation. This is what goes below the temporal, that mandibular fossa that we looked at. Any part that articulates with another bone moves. Basically, that's where we refer to that as, what is this? Condylar process. Condylar process, coronoid process, ramus of the mandible, body of the mandible, mental foramen, alveolar process. Let me just write that. Alveolar process of mandible, always. And mandibular foramen, which is the internal aspect, right there. If you're looking at this picture here, it's actually not visible, right? I couldn't find good picture of mandible. And our mandible, I have the picture of those. Mental foramen was not as visible in those either. So this is the, so not mental foramen, mandibular foramen. I'm getting hungry now. Okay. So we basically covered every bone of the skull. The rest of the pictures here, we have something similar in the textbook. So it shows you the lacrimal bone, the ethmoid bone, the orbital surface, basically. These are all the orbital surfaces. Orbital surface of sphenoid, orbital surface of frontal, orbital surface of zygomatic, orbital surface of maxilla, of lacrimal, of ethmoid. The only one that you don't see is the orbital surface of palatine bone, which is behind the ethmoid. This one shows you the supraorbital fissure and the realistic picture of the orbital surfaces. Lacrimal. Ethmoidal. Frontal. What is the sphenoid? Oh, you know what? I made a mistake. Sorry. That's not lacrimal. This is ethmoid. So sphenoid, ethmoid, lacrimal. I confused this to be nasal bone, then I noticed the suture. Lacrimal, ethmoid, sphenoid, frontal, zygomatic, maxilla. This too doesn't show the palatine. So basically the orbital surfaces of the bones. There are 7 bones that make up the orbit. The only one that's not visible easily is palatine bone. So I usually in a face-to-face class also, I say, well, forget the palatine. It's deeper to the sphenoid, deeper to the maxilla. And I have something that actually shows the palatine here. So these are for reference, but you do need to learn it as well. This is for your reference. So I got some, wherever I could, find pictures without copyright, images without copyright, and that are labeled. I downloaded. Sphenoid, ethmoid, the textbook, atlas, etc. has pretty elaborate labels. But my understanding is when I was learning this bone, just looking at the picture wasn't enough, which is why I always like to do a demo of the sphenoid and ethmoid from different angles. But just looking at the picture is hard to get the idea of what the bone looks like. So basically that's all cranium. 8 cranial bones, 14 facial bones. We went over all of them. And the sutures too. Make sure you learn the sutures. Question?
I have a question about the exam. What images will you be using? Is it just the
images that I'm providing? Yeah, these are all JPEG file. The PowerPoint that I created are basically JPEG files that I took pictures or downloaded. So images that I'm providing, I'll definitely be using those. Because there are so many images in that's available online. It will be very confusing if I just say, okay, any image. basically, that's why I'm providing you all the images that I'm likely to use on exam. So all the images that are provided, learn those. For the skull, cranial and facial bone, these are the images that, it's the same file that you guys have. So I'll say learn these images. What I'm providing, learn those images.
Thank you.
Any other question I can answer? And again, you know, I really feel strange, and I feel in a way sad that you don't get to do the actual bone lab. Can be fun. Yeah, it's a lot of name, but actually feeling the kinesthetic learning, touch, feel, turn it, look at it from inside. But what do you do? Some people were careless, then some other people were more careless, and we are where we are. Let me just stop the recording. I'm afraid I might start just saying things that I should not record.